This is Bob Oliphant from the Westford Historical Society and Museum, bringing you Episode 9 of Season 2 of the Westford Wardsman podcast. The Westford Wardsman newspaper was part of Turner's Public Spirit, a weekly newspaper in Ayer a century ago. In this episode, we'll be reading the Wardsman for the week ending Saturday, February 27, 1909. I'll elaborate on what was happening in Westford 114 years ago as we read. This week's Wardsman starts with a wedding. Westford people will be interested in a little more extended account of the marriage of Dr. and Mrs. Wells than the brief announcement that appeared in these columns last week. It took place at the home of Mr. and Mrs. Albert C. Hill, Pond Hills, Amesbury, Wednesday, February 17th. It was one of the prettiest of home weddings, simple and dignified, as befitted the tastes of the bride and groom. The bride is a daughter of the friends, that's with a capital F, of the same company of the beloved Quaker poet John Greenleaf Whittier. Whittier was born in 1807 and died in 1892. He grew up on a farm near Haverhill, Mass., and lived in Amesbury the last half of his life. The rooms were beautifully trimmed for the occasion with evergreens, carnations, and roses. One corner of the large room where the ceremony took place was banked with evergreens and the beautiful Roxbury waxwork. That's the old name, I guess, for bittersweet, what we call bittersweet. So plentiful in that locality, and now also in Westford. The bridal pair were unattended. The ceremony took place at high noon and was performed by Reverend Benjamin H. Bailey with characteristic dignity and impressiveness. He was the pastor at the Unitarian Church, the First Parish Unitarian Church in Westford. The next section is the Grange section. There was an excellent meeting of the Grange at the Town Hall Thursday evening. It was Washington evening, and the lecturer, Mr. Boynton, had planned a good patriotic program and did not have to subordinate it to other interests, but was able to carry it out with the good talent he had secured with interest to all present. The first number was the singing of the Star-Spangled Banner by the entire company with orchestral accompaniment, after which Reverend Charles P. Marshall gave a good sketch of, quote, the early life of Washington, end quote. Reverend Benjamin H. Bailey read a well-prepared paper on, quote, Washington as a military general, end quote. A song was then interspersed by Edson G. Boynton, My Dream of the USA, and hardly encored, after which G.D. Taylor told of Washington as a president in his usual interesting and original style. Miss May Grant gave a charming account of Mount Vernon, the home of Washington. This paper was so clearly written and read that those who had never seen this famous mansion very much wished they might. John P. Wright gave a paper on a trip to Washington, reminiscent of a trip enjoyed some years ago and told in his own bright, entertaining fashion. The program closed with the singing of America with the Grange Orchestra. The report of the lecture committee given by the chairman, Mr. Marshall, with its profit of 3 cents for the Treasury, was received with enthusiasm, and a rising vote of thanks was given the committee for making it the success it was. The next section is the Westford Center section. Mr. Williams, a brother-in-law of Dr. Blaney, was an over-Sunday guest at the doctor's home. Monday, February 22nd, was a good day for the holiday with its sunshine, bluebirds, robins, and balmy winds. The schools all were closed for the day, and flags were in evidence throughout the village. Among guests noticed in the hometown for the holiday were the Hall daughters at the parental home. This was probably Julia, Anna, and Marion, who were daughters of Harrison Belding Hall, who ran a grocery store in Westford Center. Edna Ferguson from teaching in New Bedford, Edith Bicknell from South Royalton, James Kimball at the Luce Homestead, Fred Johnson from Amherst College at Mrs. Carter's, Jenny M. Chandler at Mrs. J.B. Fletcher's, Clyde Carpenter at his grandmother's, Mrs. Hamlin. Her maiden name was Abby Towers. She was the widow of Samuel Hamlin. And Albert D. Taylor at F.C. Wright's. Mr. and Mrs. Abile J. Abbott and their daughter Carnzu, spelled Carnzu, left Tuesday for a California trip, expecting to be gone about 2 months. Alden Shelton of Bedford, PQ, that is province of Quebec, was a recent weekend guest of Mr. and Mrs. E.J. Whitney. Mrs. Hiram Whitney and Mr. and Mrs. Walter Wright from Brookline made a trip to their Westford home Monday. The new piano for the academy, for which the trustees recently voted $50 and the teachers and pupils recently cleared $75 by their very successful dance, arrived the first of the week. It came by team over the road from the Chickering ware rooms and promises to be a very satisfactory instrument for the school. I might add that the Chickering Piano Company was started by Jonas Chickering in Boston in 1823. It was the first piano company in the U.S., and Jonas was one of the founders of Boston's Handel and Haydn Society. He developed the cast iron frame for use in pianos, which was later adopted by piano makers worldwide. In 1852, he brought his 3 sons into partnership with him, forming Chickering and Sons. And Chickering pianos were built prior to World War II, are considered to be one of the finest quality available. Back to the Wardsman. The library will have its annual closing next month, beginning Tuesday, March 16th. A fine of 25 cents will be imposed on all books not returned on or before that date. So in this time period, everybody was supposed to return all of their books to the library once a year in March for the library to take an inventory of the books and also to clean the library. The Cavalry Association kept open house for its members last Saturday afternoon and evening with the usual good attendance. Their meeting place was the house that's now at 20 Boston Road. Mr. and Mrs. Thomas R. Fisher were at Mrs. Alvin Fisher's for the holiday. That's Thomas's mother. For the holiday, and attended the Fireman's Ball in the evening. The next section is entitled Congregational. For the next few weeks of the Lenten season, the midweek prayer meeting, which during the cold weather has been held on Thursday afternoons, will be held Wednesday evenings and will be a preaching service with the plan of having them of special interest. Mr. Marshall conducted the first one on Wednesday evening, and for the following weeks has secured various clergymen from the surrounding towns to preach. Reverend Mr. Hudson of North Chelmsford will probably be the speaker for Wednesday evening, March 8th. The next section is called The Fireman's Dance. The first annual Monday evening of the Edward M. Abbott Hose Company, No. 1 of the Westford Fire Department, proved a pleasant ending for the holiday for a large number of people. A big 4-horse barge brought a large delegation from the Chelmsford Company, besides many who came in single teams. The A.R. Choate Company of Graniteville and the John Edwards Hose Company of Forge Village were well represented, as well as many others from surrounding villages. But none other in Westford. There were just those 3 hose companies in Westford at this time, Westford Center, Forge Village, and Graniteville. Kittredge's Orchestra of Lowell furnished excellent music for dancing. The hall was simply but effectively decorated for the occasion with greenery and the national colors, while from the arch over the stage, the benignant features of Washington looked down upon the gay throng. At intermission, refreshments of ice cream and cake were served in charge of Warren E. Carkin. Edward M. Abbott, Aaron Tuttle, and Howard Ferguson were the efficient committee who so successfully carried out the details of this affair. J. Herbert Fletcher was floor director. The total financial results to the company is between $95 and $100. Washington would have probably approved of the dance, as he enjoyed dancing himself when he was a young man. The next section is Forge Village. Miss Marion Blodgett was pleasantly surprised at her home last Saturday evening when a large number of her young friends called on her and presented her a gold signet ring. This was for her 15th birthday, which was on February 15th, 1909. William Weaver, née Hannah Finch, entertained a number of her friends at tea at her home on Pond Street Monday. It was her 64th birthday, and she received many pretty remembrances. Sunday school children of St. Andrew's Mission were entertained at Recreation Hall last Saturday afternoon by the members of the LSC. That stands for Ladies Social Club, which was a Forge Village club of young ladies. And the Sunday school teachers. Ice cream and cake were served, after which games and music were enjoyed until 5 o'clock, when the little folks departed, each with a bag of candy, popcorn, and nuts. Ice cream, by the way, is spelled as one word 100 years ago. Mrs. Keefe, whose maiden name was Annie Precious, and son Michael were guests of her sister, Mrs. John Carmichael, née Harriet Precious, Saturday. Mrs. Alice Mountain has returned from Milford, New Hampshire, after an extended visit with Mr. and Mrs. Henry Byram. Through the season of Lent, there will be no dances in our village. Miss Abby M. Blaisdell, the well-known and esteemed teacher of the upper primary school, is ill at her home in Wamasett with an attack of measles. She taught last week Thursday, but did not report for duty Friday. Later, word was received that she had measles. Dr. Cyril A. Blaney was notified and ordered the building fumigated immediately. Hall and Taylor gave an entertainment Tuesday and Wednesday evenings of last week at Abbott's Hall. Notwithstanding the stormy weather, there were a goodly number in attendance. I think Hall and Taylor was a vaudeville act of the day, but I'm not positive about that. The next section is sleigh rides. Grammar school children, accompanied by their teacher, Miss L.V. Ward, enjoyed a sleigh ride Thursday afternoon, February 18th, through Groton, Ayer, and Littleton. Promptly at 1 o'clock, John Cannell, with his large two-horse sleigh, arrived at the school. Then, to the blowing of horns, waving of flags, and hurrahs, the happy crowd started for a 16-mile ride. The sleighing was fine, also the weather. All arrived home at 5 o'clock with increased appetites for their supper. Through the kindness of Mr. and Mrs. R.D. Prescott, the Ladies' Sewing Circle enjoyed a sleigh ride last week, Thursday afternoon. Mr. Prescott, with his large sleigh and two horses, took the ladies to Mrs. Hugh Ferguson's in Westford Center. After the meeting was over, Mrs. Ferguson served a dainty lunch of hot coffee and cake. A little after 4 o'clock, they returned to their homes, thanking Mr. and Mrs. Prescott for the pleasant time they had. There were 10 ladies present. The next section is Graniteville. Arthur Laney and Adeline DuPont, two well-known young people of this village, were united in marriage at St. John's Church, North Chelmsford, on Tuesday morning, February 23rd at 9 o'clock by Reverend Edward T. Schofield. Installation, I should mention that the St. John's Church in North Chelmsford was kind of the parent church of St. Catherine's here in Westford, and Reverend Schofield frequently preached at St. Catherine's also. The next section is called Installation. The public installation held in North Chelmsford on last Sunday afternoon under the auspices of Court Westford MCOF, that's the Massachusetts Catholic Order of Foresters, during which the newly elected officers of the order were properly and legally installed by Owen F. McNally, DGCR, Deputy Grand Chief Ranger, assisted by the ladies' degree staff of Merrimack Court of Haverhill, proved to be a notable occasion. The different evolutions of the degree staff were simply great and were given with a spirit and dash that would have done credit to well-trained soldiers. The ladies all wore white and gold gowns with mortar caps and presented a very fine appearance. All the movements were liberally applauded by the large number in attendance, especially pleasing being the formation of the letters MCOF, and while the cross was being formed, the choir in attendance sang the Stabat Mater, which made a deep impression. As predicted, this staff was worth going many miles to see, and it is the sincere wish of the people, both in Graniteville and North Chelmsford, that they may have the pleasure of meeting them again in the near future. Following is the list of newly elected officers of Court Westford. Joseph Wall, PCR, R.J. McCarthy, CR, Fanny McCarthy, VCR, Annie Healy, Financial Secretary, Mrs. Bridget Healy, Recording Secretary, Mrs. Julia Wall, it's abbreviated S.con. I'm not sure what that would stand for. Mrs. Elizabeth Healy, J.con, probably Senior and Junior Con, James Daly, I.S., and William J. Healy, O.S. These are all different offices within the MCOF. The success of the whole affair rests a great measure on the untiring efforts of District Deputy Owen F. McNally, Deputy for Court Westford, who had the general charge of the affair, assisted by Miss Margaret Driscoll, Mrs. W.H. Healy, and the members of the order. Mr. McNally deserves great praise for his good work, and his efforts are greatly appreciated by the members of Court Westford. The installation was very largely attended, many being present from Lowell, Ayer, Graniteville, Forge Village, and all the surrounding towns. Westford Court begins the first quarter of the year under favorable circumstances and hopes to have a big increase in membership during the coming year. The next section is called Temperance Society. Sunday was a notable occasion in St. Catherine's Church when the members for the newly formed Temperance Society manifested their faith and purpose in the organization by taking the obligation publicly in the presence of a large congregation at the 9:45 o'clock Mass. The pledge was administered by the pastor, Reverend Edmund T. Schofield, and made a deep impression on all those present. The society is now comfortably situated in cozy quarters on 5th Street, where it has rooms tastefully arranged for the members' pleasure and convenience. Several volumes of good books have been presented to the society, and more have already been promised, so in the course of time they can boast of a modest little library, which, though not great in quantity, is excellent in quality. Games of various kinds have also been introduced, and the members have some very enjoyable times while at the rooms. The membership is constantly increasing, and this society is bound to do a power of good in the community, owing to the fine example being set for the young men to follow. This organization numbers many good ball players among its members, and it is thought the society will be well represented on the diamond during the coming summer. It probably played for the Abbott Worsted baseball team. The next section is the About Town section. Mr. and Mrs. Fred A. Snow started on Monday on a trip to New York City and New Jersey to visit Miss Martha J. Taylor. This is Mr. Snow's summer vacation. I believe his wife was a daughter of Samuel Taylor, as is Martha Taylor, who they visited. William E. Edwards, the well-known contractor, is ill and under the care of Dr. Wells. Several generations were represented at a gathering for the 66th anniversary of the marriage of Mr. and Mrs. Theodore Hamblett on February 19th. Several generations were represented at this gathering, and a real live entertaining exchange of old-time reminiscences was prominent, as well as many more modern in age. Refreshments helped to sharpen up and satisfactorily season the aspect of the situation. Mr. and Mrs. Hamblett, now as of old, are active, vital forces in the welfare of society. Last week, Thursday, the washing of gravel onto the tracks of the electric road opposite the Brookside Mills caused the early morning car to be derailed, with a consequent delay of about an hour. Walter Kimball has left the employ of Hugo Page at the saw and grist mill at the Westford station and gone elsewhere. There is a woodlot in town named Elsewhere, but it is not there, but some other elsewhere. With his departure, the sound of grinding cob corn runs low. He was fine at grinding fine. William Graves of Belmont will have charge of the Fletcher Cold Spring Farm March 1st. He has been employed at the Henry Fletcher Farm at Belmont for several years. The first annual report of the directors of the water company, of the Westford Water Company, has been printed and is before the public, and is an eminently encouraging and businesslike exposition of the year's work of this newly organized association of capital for labor and financial economy and supplying a domestic necessity. From this report, some condensed vital facts are pertinent for public perusal. There are 217 water takers. As correctly interpreted, it refers to places, not persons. The unprecedented drought last season came very near making the town shed tears at the thought of its past folly when it took counsel of its own unfounded and confounded fright and refused to investigate a town water supply. It was that which encouraged several members of the town to form a company to provide water. There are 8.16 miles of pipe, one steel standpipe 90 feet in height and 18 feet in diameter, with a capacity of 172,000 gallons on Prospect Hill at Westford Center. One steel standpipe 60 feet high and 30 feet in diameter, with a capacity of 318,000 gallons, erected on Town Farm Hill to supply the villages of Graniteville and Forge. There are still tanks on both of those sites, by the way. The total cost of the plant, including 16 hydrants, a suction gas producer, pumping plant with buildings at Pine Ridge, is about $81,000. There are 10 driven wells, and the severe drought demonstrated a never-failing supply, and the monthly analysis by the state demonstrates that the purity of this water is unsurpassed in the state, and only 2 towns equal it. The total amount of coal consumed from January 1st, 1908 to January 1st, 1909 was 33 tons, 862 pounds. The total amount of water pumped to standpipes over that same period was 12.9 million gallons. The company have made many improvements during the year that will reduce future running expenses, and it is gratifying as well as public surprise that the balance sheet of the first year shows only the small deficit of $49.54 in receipts over expenses, including permanent improvements, which the second year will reckon as expenses. Let the whole town join in the chorus of hurrah for the Westford Water Company in its first experiment stages. Any who cannot join in this chorus, go hide thyself on a lonely island and live to thy lonesome self. Sounds like Samuel Taylor. The next section is the Grange, the last section also. The next meeting of Grange, Thursday evening, March 4th, will be a regular preliminary sparring for standing room at the coming town meeting, and the closing of schools is coming up for exhibition in sparring when the following resolution comes up for discussion. Resolved, that the consolidation of schools is a benefit to the rural community. On the affirmative of this question are H.B. Reed and Samuel L. Taylor. On the negative, Frank C. Wright and Mrs. Joseph E. Knight. Something is certainly going to fall about this time. It won't be a pin either. You certainly couldn't hear that, but just as like as not, someone will meet with a pinfall. The warrant will be up for discussion also, unless the pinfall resolution occupies all attention and all time. We'll hear more about that debate in next week's podcast. That's the news in Westford for the week ending February 27th, 1909. Thank you for listening, and thanks to Nick Woodbury of WestfordCAT for providing technical support. You can find transcriptions and podcasts from the Wardsman at our website at museum.westford.org, or visit the Historical Society's Facebook page for more Westford news from a century ago. This is Bob Oliphant, and I hope you will join us for next week's Westford Wardsman podcast. Thank you.